All right, guys, we are back to look at our second passage. So, we just finished up looking at the passage that was called Orphan Train Riders, which was our historical account. Now we are moving on to the next passage, which is called The Train to Somewhere, um, which is our historical fiction piece. So, before we get started, I have rewritten the title of our lesson up at the top across the top of the page. We know the title of our lesson is Comparing and Contrasting Genres. And we know comparing means that we are looking for the similarities, contrasting means we are trying to find the differences. And we know we have 5 genres of literature: we have fiction, nonfiction, drama, poetry, and folklore. But for this lesson, we are primarily focused on fiction and nonfiction. Okay, so like I just mentioned, this is a historical fiction text. It tells us that right here where it says genre. And because we know this is historical fiction, we know it falls under our larger category of just fiction, which means that it is not real or not entirely real, at least. We talked about it a little bit before, but historical fiction is unique because it is set in the past and it combines historical details with fictional elements. Okay, so when you are looking at any piece of literature that is labeled as historical fiction, you know that it's going to combine, like I just said, those historical details with fictional elements. So, just like the historical account we just looked at, there are probably going to be some historical facts, such as important historical figures, the dates that events happened, those events that actually happened, maybe the location, maybe it'll talk about the time period. It's going to give you some detail about whatever the historical event or a person or whatever it is that the passage is talking about. But it's going to combine that with things that are fictional. So, whenever I say things that are fictional, what I am really talking about are our story elements. Okay, so our story elements are going to consist of a few things. We know that you only have story elements if things are fiction, right? And we know the purpose of anything fiction is to entertain the reader. And we know story elements primarily you've got to start out with some type of characters, right? You've got to have characters. We know that those characters are probably going to talk to each other, so you may have some dialogue. And we know the events that happen in the story. Those would be considered your plot. You have, if you were to draw your plot graph or your plot diagram, you would have your exposition, your rising action, your climax, falling action, and your resolution. All of that is made up of the plot. So, what happens in the story? You know that your story's got to take place somewhere. So, you're going to have some type of setting. There are going to be problems that the characters face. So, you're going to have some type of conflict, right? If you've got conflict, you've got to have resolution, remember, which is part of your plot. And we know that you are also going to have theme, right? Which is the lesson that the main character learns. And we know anytime we are looking at a passage like this, anything fictional, you can always figure out the tone of the passage as well. So now that we have talked about a few elements of historical fiction, and how it combines those historical details with things that are fiction, let's go ahead and start looking at our passage. So, the title of this is going to be The Train to Somewhere. So, because I know I'm comparing and contrasting genres, I know that this fictional story is probably going to have something to do with the orphan train riders that I already read about in the historical account on the previous page. So, I know it's kind of already going to have something to do with that. So I'm kind of one step ahead of the game because I know it's going to be about the same thing, but this is fictional, right? So let's go ahead and make sure we have our paragraph numbers circled. for this passage, I have 7 paragraphs to look at. Okay. So, before we actually get started reading, let's look at our study buddy and see what specifically our study buddy wants us to look for the first time that we read. So, the study buddy says, as I read, I will think about how this child's experience is similar to and different from the details described in Orphan Train Writers. So, Orphan Train Writers is the name of the nonfiction text that we just looked at on the previous page, the historical account. And as we read this passage, we're going to see how the child's experience is similar and different. So we're trying to compare and contrast. We're trying to see what's similar, what's different from the passage we have already read. So what you're going to do for me, guys, since this is part 4, you're going to do the hard work on your own. You are going to read this passage, all 7 paragraphs, and as you read the first time, which is just for understanding, you are going to think about what is the same and what is different from that passage that we've already looked at, the Orphan Train Writers. I want you to think about how it's similar, how it's different. All right, so I want you guys to read this once on your own, and when you come back, we will start going through our close reading together. All right, so good luck and go ahead and get started for me. All right, guys, so I am assuming that you have read this passage once and you have read the story of the child and their experience as an orphan train writer. And what all that encompassed. So now that you have read it once, and hopefully you've thought about those similarities and those differences, and you already have some ideas, we're going to go ahead and look at our first close reading box, which says compare the dates, people, places, and events described in the previous passage to those described in this story. You have to underline any facts that are similar. So for this close reading, we are only focused on those similarities. So I want you to think, what is similar? What is the same as what we read in the passage on the previous page? I want you to look for dates, people, places, and events that are described in this passage, in the previous passage, and I want you to see what's the same. If you find any of those facts that are the same, I want you to underline them. So for this, you are mostly looking for those historical details, the dates, the people, the places, the events, and you are going to underline it if it is the same or similar. All right, guys, so I want you to do this for me. Go through the paragraphs, see what you can find and underline, and when you have that done, come back and I will show you what I found. All right, good luck. All right, guys, I'm assuming that you are back because you have completed your first close reading and you are ready to go through it and kind of talk about some things. So, I'm going to show you guys what I underlined. You may not have underlined the exact same thing as I did, and if you didn't, that's okay, but you need to make sure whatever you underlined can also be found in the historical account on the previous page. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I underlined in paragraph 2 is the part of the sentence that says, we had lived on the streets. I know that this is a detail that can also be found in the historical account that we've already looked at. In the historical account, in that first paragraph, it says that the streets of New York City were filled with 30,000 poor and hungry children. So they were orphans. They were living on the street. They were poor. They were hungry. They had no shelter. So I know that this is a historically accurate detail that can be found in both passages, so I underlined it. The next thing I underlined says the Children's Aid Society sheltered us. So, based on the previous passage, I already know a little bit about the Children's Aid Society. I know that, well, number one, it's mentioned in the historical account. And I know the Children's Aid Society gave shelter to all those orphans who were living on the streets. And then I also underlined that they were shipping us on an orphan train to a new home and a new life. So I know the Children's Aid Society was responsible for this first the orphan train movement. They were shipping those orphan children um to rural areas in the United States and Canada to go to a new home, to start a new life. So even though this passage is written in first person point of view, I know the details are still accurate based on what I read in the historical accounts. Even though this is written in first person, they use words like I, we, us. There's still accurate details that can be found in the historical account. So, with that being said, the next thing I underlined was in paragraph 4. I said, we were led to a large hall and seated on a stage in front of a crowd of strangers. I know that this matches what is written in the historical account. In paragraph 4 of your historical account, it says the orphans were cleaned up and displayed on stage. So I know that the orphans, they were taken to an area that had a stage. I know that the people who were potential adopters of these orphans were in that same area and they were looking at the kids up on the stage. So I know that this is a historical fact. I can prove it by looking at the historical account that I have already read. So I know that that's important. Even though, once again, even though it's written in first person, it's still a historically accurate detail. Okay, so now let's look at paragraph 7, the last thing I underlined. I said two caring people who became our new family and who made us who we are today. So, based on the historical account, I know that even though some orphans didn't have the best outcome, a lot of them did. They were adopted or taken in by people who cared for them. And I know that we know that the program resulted in a lot of positive outcomes. It tells us that in paragraph 5 of the historical account, Orphan Train Riders. So, I know that that is a historically accurate detail that can be found in both passages, so I chose to underline it. All right, so those were the things I underlined. Those were the similarities that I noticed. You can find all of these things in both passages. They're all historically accurate details that are in both. So now that we have done that, we're going to look at our second closer reading box, which says, which details come from the author's imagination? Draw a box around 3 story elements that show that it is a work of fiction. So, you are looking for your story elements once again. So, we've listed these up at the top of the page so you can easily go back and look for those story elements that you need to find. So, for example, you're going to be looking for invented characters, dialogue, setting, plot, theme, tone, all of that. You're going to find all of those things, or at least look for those things. You've got to find at least 3, according to this close reading box. So, we know right now we've already found the historically accurate details that are in both passages. Now we've got to figure out what makes this work fiction. How do we know this is invented or imaginary and not a historical account? So we've got to figure out what makes it fiction, and we can figure out what makes it fiction by looking at those story elements that we have listed up top. So I want you to take a minute. I want you to look back through these paragraphs from The Train to Somewhere, and I want you to see if you can find things that make this fiction. So, those story elements, when you find them, I want you to draw a box around them. There are several, so you should have no problem finding at least 3. All right, guys, when you have this done, I want you to come back and we will go over the ones that I found. All right, good luck. All right, guys, I'm assuming you're back. You have just finished up your last close reading box for The Train to Somewhere, and now you are ready to discuss What makes this fiction and not a historical account? So, you had to find at least three story elements that show that this is a work of fiction, and you had to draw a box around them. So, one of the first things that I noticed that makes this a work of fiction is the fact that we have a character, right? If you paid attention to the point of view, we know that this is written in first person, which means we have a single character who is telling the story from their point of view. They use words like I, me, my, we, us. It's coming straight from them. So it never gives us the character's name. I don't think. But yeah, no, it doesn't. But we know that we have this main character, right? And if you think back to the historical account that we've already read, they never mentioned any specific orphans, right? They were just talking about the orphan train riders in general. They never singled out one orphan to tell their story. So we know that the orphan who's telling the story in The Train to Somewhere is a fictional character. We know that because well, number one, they never mention their name, so we can't really prove that this is a real person. So we know that this is a fictionalized story about this orphan's experience riding the orphan train and going to a new home. So, with that being said, the first thing I boxed in was in paragraph 1. I boxed in the sentence that says, my heart was in my throat as Robbie and I boarded the train in New York City that April day. So we know we've got this character, who's just referred to as I, right? Because it's first person point of view. And we have this other character whose name is Robbie, right? And we later find out that they are brother and sister. So we have these two orphans, and they are getting ready to ride the train. So I know straight off the bat that this is a story element because I have two two characters listed. I have Robbie, and then I have the little orphan who's telling the story. So I have two characters, and I know characters are a story element. And I know that these are not real people, right? Because there's no documentation. They were not mentioned in the historical account. So I chose to box that in. So the second thing I boxed in was this section of paragraph 2. At age 5, I thought myself lucky. At least I had my older brother at my side. I could still remember Mama humming as she cooked dinner and my father's smiling face, but they had both died. So this, guys, would be part of your plot. And this is actually some exposition. We are learning the backstory of our main character, the person who's telling the story. So we know when they were 5 years old, um, right now they are 5 years old when all this is happening to them, and they think that they're lucky because at least they've still got their brother. And we find out what happened to their parents and how they are in this situation to begin with. So I know plot is a story element, and this is fictionalized, right? This is part of the character story, and we've already talked about how the character is made up. And this part of the plot, if you were to draw out your plot diagram, this is your exposition. So I know this is a story element. It makes the text historical fiction, so I chose to box that in. So the next thing I have is in paragraph 3. I boxed in where were we going and what would happen to us. Our destination and future were unclear and unknown. So this is fictional because it kind of shows us the main character's feelings. It lets us know how they're feeling right now. So this provides some characterization. We know that right now this character is confused. They don't really know what's happening. They are getting ready to step into the unknown, and that could be a little bit worrisome right now. So I know that this part of paragraph 3 kind of also lends a hand to the tone. It makes the tone be kind of weary, right, or negative, which definitely is not a good thing right now, right? Because the character doesn't really understand what's going on. I don't think any 5-year-old would understand. So, this is fictionalized because it lets us know how our main character is feeling. And once again, that main character is a fictional character that the author has created. They're imaginary, they're not real. So the next thing I boxed in was at the end of paragraph 4. It says, "Suddenly I was staggered by a terrible thought. What if Robbie and I went to different homes in different towns and were separated permanently?" So I know this is fictional, once again, because it's from the main character's point of view, and they're talking about their brother Robbie, who is also a fictional character. And I know that this is kind of letting me see the characters' thoughts and their worries and their feelings right now, which are kind of very overwhelming and negative once again. So, like, this lends a hand to the tone as well. And then it just, like I said, we get to see the characters' thoughts and their worries, which I know are fictionalized. So, with that being said, the last thing I boxed in was this entire, well, really just the rest of the passage. So paragraph 5, 6, and 7. So I chose to box this in for several reasons. So I boxed it in. One big reason is because it has dialogue, and we know dialogue is when the characters talk to each other. So we know another character is introduced. It says, "What do you know about farming?" A man asked Robbie gruffly. So I know there's a man talking to Robbie, and I can probably assume, right, that this man is also a fictionalized character. And Robbie responds, and then we see some more dialogue that says, "Now Jacob," said a plain woman behind the man. So now we have another character, a woman, who is talking to the man whose name is apparently Jacob, right? And then she goes on to say, "Don't start off by scaring them." So she also says, "Are you brother and sister? Would you both like to come live with us?" So this provides dialogue while adding to the plot of the story. So we know, plot or the events that happen in the story. So we know that they are potentially getting ready to adopt the main character and her brother, because they say, "Do you want to come live with us?" Right? So the last paragraph, paragraph 7, um, kind of brings us up to speed where our main character is in life right now, and it provides us with some resolution, which is a plot element. So we know that this is 70 years later, and the main character still remarks how well their luck has held. So they think that they've been pretty lucky. It wasn't just that Robbie and I were raised together or that our lives were all pleasure and no pain. So they didn't have any worries, really. It was that the Larsons came to take us home that day, two caring people who became our new family and who made us who we are today. So, this brings us to our resolution, which once again is a plot element, and it lets us know how the narrator, our main character, feels about being adopted by the Larsons, so Jacob and his wife. So, that lets us know how they feel. So, the things that we have boxed in let us know that this is a fictional story, that this is not 100% historically accurate, because it has some aspects which are invented, right? Such as the characters, the dialogue, the plot, right? And throughout this, we've been talking a little bit about tone, right? So we have a few things we could have for tone for this. I'd say at the beginning of the story, the tone would probably be more negative, right? But as the story progresses, it shifts to a more positive tone, right? Because it goes from kind of upsetting to hopeful. And then we know that the narrator does end up having a positive outlook at the end, right? When they are reflecting on what all has happened to them and how lucky they were. All right, so guys, that's gonna wrap us up for the train to somewhere. I'm gonna end the video, and in the next video, we are gonna go ahead and go over to the next page, and we are going to answer the multiple choice questions, and we are going to get started on the writing question that goes along with these two passages. So, if you need to make any more annotations for this passage, go ahead and do that before you end the video or before you move on to the next video, because the next video will be the questions in the writing prompt. So, if you have any questions about any of the annotations that I made, or any questions about orphan train writers or historical accounts versus historical fiction, make sure to let me know. All right, guys, I will see you in the next video.